hand up the palm right now?
This is about normal.
Okay, good.
All right, well, so we're recording now, so let's start off by way of introduction. I'll start since all of these people know who I am, but
Sure.
Nobody in the video yet knows who I am. I'm Rennie Salata. I'm the pastor of Acton United Methodist Church. I have been a believer most of my life, and I'll say more about my journey as I get going.
Sure. I'm Michael Ashworth. I'm currently a student in UT Knoxville's Master of Public Policy and Administration program. I've been a non-believer since about the age of 13, so that would have been 97-ish. And again, this is the history we'll go into more detail about, so that's who I am.
Cool. Well, I want to give you guys some background about me and Mike, feel free to throw in wherever you want, or stop me if I get to just downright lying. But Mike and I have been friends since before we were born. That is to say, our mothers were friends while they were pregnant with each other. Used to take walks on the same street in Louisiana where we were both born, and have not always lived proximately to each other or always necessarily been the closest of friends, but for most of our growing up and formative years and in between, we've always managed to keep contact. And every so often, after a several-year stint of not really communicating, one or the other of us will go, "Hey, I wonder what he's up to these days," and we'll reach out, and thanks to the gifts of the internet and Facebook and stuff like that, we're able to stay in contact with each other. And so that's kind of the beginning of our friendship. What would you say, Mike, are some of the defining characteristics of our friendship?
We've got a lot of shared interests. We're both huge science fiction nerds. We've had parallel hobbies in terms of gaming and the like. We were both big into Magic the Gathering for a few years there. I might be outing him as a bigger dweeb than he's presented himself as.
Remember, these people have known me for less than a year, so not everything is on
It's approved.
So I can just parachute in and air all the dirty laundry then. No, but we always have great fun together when we get the chance to be together. It was kind of in our early even before our early teens, when I moved to Tennessee, and he had been living here for not here, but there for a few years. And so that's when our parents and Rennie and I got back in touch, and we started hanging out on a regular basis again, and found out that we did have all of these parallel interests. And so we've stayed in decent touch since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Mike and I would frequently get together from, gosh, I guess it was probably about the age of 10 or 11.
Yeah.
Well into our teens, and have sleepovers, and stay up all night playing video games, or yes, Magic the Gathering, which actually I still enjoy. I've thought about getting back into that, but
I'm paying tuition, so I don't have the money for that particular hobby.
So we've had that going. So yeah. Why don't you talk a little bit about kind of what the impetus was for us getting together and doing this?
Okay. You want me to go with the specific incident? Okay.
Either or, however you want to do it.
Back in 2014, when Rennie was pastoring over in Canton, North Carolina, there was a student at Pisgah High School who wanted to set up a chapter of the Secular Student Alliance. It's a social group for non-theistic students to get together and just have some fun. The high school administration was very sour to this, prohibited them from doing it. This got some backlash from Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is a group that provides legal support for these kinds of separation of church and state issues. And it spiraled into this huge thing. And over such an innocuous action as starting a high school club. And so Rennie and I got to talking on and off about this, about how these little things where religious and non-religious groups see a conflict turn into these huge deals that wind up dominating a community and making people feel really put out. And we wanted to try to clear up some differences and show where sometimes there's common ground we have, where the religious and non-religious communities can work together, and where certain actions really are just innocuous. We're not trying to be a threat.
Yeah, and from my side, my desire was actually from witnessing the way that many of the fellow classmates, high school students of this girl, who also were involved with churches as well as their parents, responded in some very non-Christian ways to this young woman. It wasn't just disagreement or expressing reasoned concern about such a group or what it would involve or anything like that. It was downright vitriolic and hateful speech, even as far as death threats to her and her family from some people within religious communities. And I and other pastors just thought this is terrible. And so it's taken us a little longer than anticipated to put this together and some further conversation, but I think actually it helps make the conversation be something broader than being just in the middle of that drama. But I think it's also, for both of us, we'd like to take a start toward being able to have conversations rather than debates or arguments or winners and losers and all that kind of thing. And truthfully, as we were looking at the broader spectrum of relationships, that was pretty much all we saw. There is no shortage of YouTube videos from both religious and non-religious groups where a Christian leader or thinker is pitted against a non-religious person, and if it's coming from a non-religious group, the non-religious person is the winner, and if it's coming from a Christian group, then the Christian person is the winner. And we just felt like that was not framing the conversation in any kind of a helpful way. So we're hoping that this conversation will be a model for what kinds of friendships and conversations are possible between religious and non-religious persons.
I'm not here to beat the belief out of her.
and I am not here to convert you. But so on that score, I thought a good place to start would be with some of the nomenclature around non-belief. We hear a lot in the church these days, especially about the nuns. Mm-hmm. Atheist is a term that often carries a lot of negative weight behind it, in the same way that in some countries and some places of the world still Christian carries the same kind of prejudices. So just talk a little bit about what that experience has been like for you and some of the different terminology and what it means and that kind of thing.
Sure. So in the popular media, you hear a lot about the growth of the nuns. And that's kind of the broadest categorization of people who are not an active part of a religious denomination. These can be atheists, they can be all manner of non-believer. They can also be people who do believe in some form of deity, but they just don't attend, or they don't identify with any denomination or religion. when you look at the breakdown, and I might go a little into the weeds here, if you'll indulge me. When you look at the breakdown, you see about a third of the nuns are people who self-identify as atheists or non-believers. You see about a third of them are people who don't identify that way, but they don't believe in deities, gods, pantheons. So they would fit the definition, but they don't use the term. And then you've got about a third of that group who are people who have, for whatever reason, left a church, but they still hold to some of those beliefs. Getting a little more specific, like I said, there's a long list of terms that could keep us here until 4 p.m. I self-identify as an atheist. Very broadly, this just means I don't believe in a God. More specifically, some people will lump in they don't believe in other forms of supernatural, they don't believe in souls and so forth, but that's adding on to the definition. Are there any other particular terms you want me to hit at here?
Well, so one of the other ones I think that shows up a lot and that I think often will bristle people in the religious community, particularly Christian community, because of actually some really old arguments, is secular and humanist.
Okay.
So if you would kind of address those as well.
Humanist is a label for philosophy. It has to do with finding intrinsic value in human beings. Your life is worthwhile because you are living it. It's a unique experience. That in itself is something worth cultivating and maintaining. Secular can have a few different meanings depending on the context it's being used in. Broadly speaking, it's about a separation of, well, let me say in politics and government, it's about a separation of church and state. It's where churches shouldn't have undue influence over the government, and likewise the government should not be stepping in and dictating what Rennie should be preaching. In other contexts, it can also, when a person's describing themselves as secular, that can be another way of saying that they aren't affiliated with a church. Like I said, this is a word with a fuzzier definition than some of the other ones I've been discussing. But broadly speaking, it means that something is in some way separate from religion.
And I know with secular, and I'm not completely clear about atheist, but I know a number of these terms are actually constructs of the religious or Christian community that were created and used as labels for non-believers or groups of people outside. I know secular in particular was part of an early move in about the 1800s. We won't go into all that kind of thing. I'm not as clear about atheist. I know there have been some suggestions that it was originally a Roman Catholic nomenclature, but I don't know.
I've heard all manner of history on that particular word. The furthest back I've heard was it was used by Roman pagans. So this was ancient Rome, where you still had the predominant belief was in the polytheistic pantheon of the time. And they would actually describe Christians as atheists because they didn't believe in the pantheon of gods, which I'm not a historian of that period, so I can't speak to the veracity of that history, but that's kind of the most interesting version of it that I've heard.
I feel like there may be actually some reference to it in some of the early letters we have from some church leaders during that time in their exchanges with the Roman Empire when they were both before Constantine mucked the whole thing up. All right. So I guess along those terms, how have you ever felt yourself othered, restricted, put upon, whatever, socially speaking, because of a label of atheist, non-religious, non-believer?
Well, it was something in the early years when I had kind of just come out of the religion where I really felt the social stigma at the time because on the very rare occasion that I would try to use that label to define myself, just people wouldn't want to have anything to do with me at that point. So there was a very long time there where I would just continue identifying as a Christian, even though I wasn't, because there was a very high social cost to where I would be ostracized if I labeled myself as I was. As the years went on, I started to care less and less about that, because it's kind of like, if the jerks are going to ostracize you, they're jerks who you don't want to associate with anyway. So I loosened on that, and eventually, when I started undergrad when I was about 19, that was when I said I'm not maintaining an act anymore. And when the discussion of religion comes up, I openly identify as an atheist now. I'll proactively identify as an atheist when the situation is appropriate. I'm not going to walk into a church service, kick Rennie off the pulpit, and say, "I'm an atheist, deal with it."
Though he has tried. No. Since you've become open, though, about being an atheist, what are some of the reactions that you usually get, either from broader society or from Christians or religious persons in general?
Sure. In the workplace in particular, I find that when it comes up and when I identify as an atheist, a lot of people will have this knee-jerk reaction to, this is an argument, I must now defend my belief. And so I get a lot of pop apologetics quoted at me. If you're familiar with Norman Geisler, you may have heard the phrase, "I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. If you say it to me, it's not the first time I've heard it this week." And in some ways I've gotten used to that, but in some ways it's just really tiresome. Like I've spoken to this point so many times, I'm just tired of hearing about it. And I can't hold that against the person who I'm speaking with, because they've got these preconceived notions built up around the label atheist, and I may have heard this argument many, many, many times, but they've only ever delivered it once. So it's fresh material to them and really tiresome old material to me.
Great, that's good. One of the other aspects of who you are, and one of the things actually that I find that you and I have a lot of agreement on, comes actually from another part of your self-identifying, which is not your atheism, but as a secular activist. In the Facebook event for this, you described yourself as a secular activist.
Yes.
So I was wondering, what is a secular activist? And what do you hope to achieve through that work? Why is this something that's important to you?
Sure. And there's kind of two aspects to my self-identifying as a secular activist. One of it is, one side of that is events like this, where I do kind of want to address that social stigma against atheists and the non-religious community, to where it doesn't have to be a fight every time we come into contact. It's about to sucker punch me over here. I've probably had it coming. But yeah, addressing that social stigma is a big part of it. I'd like the world to be a place where, when we have common cause to work together, we can do that without it being a big source of conflict. The other aspect of that is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a separation of church and state issue where a lot of politicians will want to implement policies that are either rooted specifically and exclusively in their religious belief, which I don't think is a good form of governance. So there needs to be voices opposing that. And there's people who maybe they've got a more mercenary cause in mind than advancing their religion, and they just couch their policy proposals in religious language, and I would want to put a stop to that as well, because that's just misleading.
Cool. Great. What got you connected with that work?
I mean, really it started out where as I came out more, I started looking for social groups that I could be a part of where where I could have a space to go to where if religion came up, it wouldn't be a huge argument. And so I found groups like the Atheist Society of Knoxville and like Sunday Assembly, where you can have discussion groups. The topic of religion may or may not come up, and you can discuss it in a civil manner with like-minded people so that you can not necessarily live in a bubble, but refine your ideas before you present those ideas to people who might want to poke holes in them. And then through these social groups, I then started to see that there were people who shared my concern about excessive religious influence in politics and government, and they were actually taking active steps to oppose that. And so that's how I got in touch with organizations like the Secular Coalition for America and the Freedom from Religion Foundation, who take a more active political role.
And that was actually something for me that I was surprised to learn as we began talking more and more about this, is I had never thought about, really had no idea that there were communities of non-religious people that had organized themselves around this. I was even more surprised to discover that there's such a thing as the Sunday Assembly that generally meets on Sundays to talk about these kinds of things.
Atheists tend to be free on Sundays.
Right.
It's a good day to organize stuff.
One of the advantages of being part of an Anglo-Saxon Western European society where Sundays were a mandated day off for so long. But it created in me a new appreciation and understanding for non-religious people, this idea that they too come together, seek a group of people who share thoughts around things, want a place where they can discuss these things, ask questions, that sort of thing.
Well, humans are a social species, so we want to get together and work with at least small groups of friends. So when you leave religion, this institution that you've embedded yourself in, that provides you a lot of your social contacts through childhood and especially into adulthood, all of a sudden that's kind of gone. Some denominations are more forceful than others about ostracizing former members. So there does need to be something to fulfill that social need and desire apart from the religious institution. And so that's where a lot of these groups have sprung up. As the non-religious population continues to grow, there needs to be these mechanisms by which people can socialize and network without necessarily having it entangled in these beliefs that they no longer hold.
Yeah, good. I think I've kind of covered the vast majority of my questions. So we'll flip the tables in case you need the notes from our previous conversation. Now you get to interview me.
Sure. So we know you're big wig in the church now. As a matter of personal privilege, I happen to remember a time where being a church leader wasn't necessarily your career goal. If I'm not getting too personal, do you mind speaking about how this became one of your goals?
Absolutely. I grown up in the church, but I grew up in a very conservative denomination of the church. And actually, when I was part of that group at a fairly young age, I had expressed some desire to become a pastor. But my pastor at the time quite flatly said, "No, you don't." And
sometimes the pastor isn't always right.
not at that church.
Not at that one, clearly.
But for me, that was kind of a moment. Well, okay, he's the pastor, right? He must know. And then actually, I went through a period of even questioning my own faith, and what do I really believe? Do I really believe this? I stopped going to that church. I kept going to a church because my mother wanted me to, but then I eventually just stopped going to church altogether for several years. And then it wasn't until I was getting ready to graduate that I got reconnected with the church, but not because it was the church, but because I had to do an internship kind of thing for graduation. And the Methodist church there in Maryville had the best music leader that I could get access to through some connections. And so basically I went and did a 15-week internship with the music director at the Methodist church, thinking that I was going to go on to be a musician, a choral conductor and composer. And it was actually while I was there in that community, plus some of my question asking, trying meaning making around setting what my beliefs were going to be for the rest of my life. Basically, that kind of conversation turning point that I think everybody hopefully comes to. While I was there, I just had a really powerful experience with the people there, who really showed me a different God than what I had experienced growing up, and one that I had also found was revealed in the Bible. And then that was accompanied with a physical experience, and I know this makes me sound crazy, but also an audible voice, that it was really like my insides were wrapped in a warm blanket one day, and I heard a voice say, "Here I am." And that was the beginning of my journey back to God and to religion. And then as I continued in that and worked with one of the pastors there and a group of young adults, we went on a retreat, and a number of people who were there identified gifts in me that are generally employed in the local church as pastor. And so that got me to thinking about that. I think probably the final nail in the coffin on music as a career was when I applied for graduate studies in a program. It was highly competitive. And I went to the interview and the audition, and everything went great until I got to the oral skills portion, where they test your ability to identify chords and tones and that kind of thing just simply by hearing them, and I choked it completely. And it was a skill that I had not really struggled with much when I was in school. And so at that point I began going, okay, I have two choices. Either this is not what I'm meant to do for my life, this is not what I'm really passionate about, or I need to step it up and develop this skill so well that never, ever, ever happens again. Mm-hmm. And as I began to do that, and actually I worked with a professor of mine who is not a Christian, but is a religious person. Through that process, I identified for myself my passions and gifts. And that's what led me down this path. And as I've gotten deeper and deeper into pastoral ministry, I've had more affirmations from the folks that I've worked with, as well as just in myself feeling like I am fulfilling what I was made for, what I exist to do.
Sure.
So that's that's kind of how that transition happened for me.
Okay. And you mentioned that you transitioned from a more conservative church to a more liberal church over the course of this process. Was there a change in belief associated with that, or were you shifting to a church that more closely matched your beliefs?
Yes.
A little from column A, a little from column B?
Yeah. I think what allowed the shift initially was the fact that the United Methodist Church already in many ways aligned with what I had already instinctively believed and understood about God, and what I had experienced for myself, but at least on paper was still conservative enough in its theology that it didn't create too much dissonance with all of the interpretations and dogma that I had been laden with. So for me, it was kind of the place where I could slip in without too much cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
But as I continued to be part of the Methodist Church and that movement, that opened me to the possibility for changes in how I interpreted Scripture, even just the idea that there's more than one interpretation of Scripture, that's what we actually do when we read Scripture is interpret it, was a jump for me. But also, too, and this is just one of the unique things about the United Methodist denomination, is that we weren't formed like many of the more conservative denominations out of some bickering point over dogma or theology. We were formed as a renewal movement out of the Church of England to actually bring the Holy Spirit back into a church that had basically become just a flat line, you go because it's the state church kind of thing, but with no real belief associated with that. And so because of that, our theology isn't centered or rooted in a particular dogma or list of, you have to adhere or believe in X, Y, Z in order to actually be part of. There's no litmus test, in other words. And so that also opened me up to deeper exploration around theology and questions of belief and practice. That was the biggest thing, too, was that the Methodist Church married what Charles Wesley, brother of John Wesley, they were founders of this movement. And Charles Wesley, in one of his hymn texts, wrote knowledge and vital piety combined. And the Methodist Church, I felt, took this set of beliefs that they had derived from Scripture, and then they actually put them into practice on the ground with people. And that was something that I hadn't really seen a lot of in the church that I had grown up with. There were a lot of people who went across the ocean to go be missionaries, but in terms of being a community that was actually interested in reaching out to the person across the street, regardless of where they found themselves in life, that just was not a part of what I had. And so I really appreciated this Methodist emphasis on, the neighbor.
Sure. I find it interesting about the timeline that's built up now, because that means that the last church I went to on any kind of remotely regular basis was the church you came out of. I didn't realize that. So, as your beliefs shifted, did you find that there was any kind of social cost to that? Or because you were kind of staying under the Christian label, was it not as big a deal?
I can't really say that there was a significant social cost or impact. There was actually, though, quite a backlash from a number of people in the church that I came out of, who had labeled Methodists basically as not Christian. And most notably was, my mother, who was still at that church, who now attends the Methodist church that I went to, by the way. There's a whole other transition right there.
I knew that transition happened at some point, but I don't know all the details of it.
We can share that another time.
Sure.
But, was that while she was still there, I had, felt called to pastoral ministry, and I decided to go to Duke to pursue my seminary education. And Mom wanted to, I guess, have her mind put at ease that what I was going to learn at Duke was not going to lead me further down the path astray or something.
Oh, that's what I'm here for.
Or that I wasn't getting some kind of heresy or something put into me. And so she went to one of the members at the church who was an ordained pastor in that denomination, who's now in real estate, by the way. And so, unbeknownst to me, he emailed the then dean of the seminary and basically asked him, "What's your position on the inerrancy of Scripture?" A very sort of conservative litmus test question. And then the dean, of course, responded to him very graciously, very openly, and very, in some ways, I felt vaguely. Though I can't blame him because it was an email conversation.
Right.
And so he forwarded that to me, and I lost it. I went off. I kid you not, I wrote a very, very vitriolic email to him in response to that. I felt that he had unjustly judged me and judged the institution, and really just judged him, basically. And he wrote back, and I think only through a gift of the Holy Spirit, said, "Well, now you've judged me." And I wrote back and said, "Let's get together for breakfast, and let's actually talk about this," because I really felt convicted about what I had done in terms of taking it so far. And so we got together and we sat down and we talked. And when we actually talked to each other, he still didn't agree with me on any of the changes that I had gone through theologically and in my belief, but he was willing to respect me, where I was in my faith journey, that it was a genuine faith in Christ, and that Duke was not going to turn me into some sort of heretic, I guess. But there were definitely relationships that went by the wayside as a result of that. That being said, what was lost was far outweighed by what has been gained, just in terms of my own peace, really feeling like I'm in a place where, there's space to ask questions, and that was something that didn't exist so much there. The other big thing for me that was nice was I later went back to that church for worship service because Mom was still attending there, and I had, childhood family friends that were there. And the big eye-opening moment for me was that being there with them in that worship service, I found I disagree with you on many, many points of theology, but I deeply respect that you also are on this journey of faith, and that you hold these beliefs genuinely, that you're trying to figure it out just like anybody else. Sure. And so in that regard, I cannot be quite so harsh and judgmental on you. So that was also a moment of healing for me within that as well. That I don't know if they ever saw me that way. I'm sure some of them still think I'm a heretic, but many of them, and actually it's all the ones who have now left that congregation. I feel like we were able to reconnect in some positive ways.
Yeah. I find it really telling that breakfast you had, where you didn't necessarily set aside your differences, but you came together to actually address them with that person. That was a helpful moment.
It was, very much so.
So, Now I want to get into some of the questions about community interactions. Seems like a nice segue.
Sure.
And I'm kind of asking you to speculate with this first one because you don't strike me as the kind of person who actively puts people out over differences of belief or opinion. But
Well, there was only one this week, so.
He's getting better. But there are these groups and these people who, when they find out that there is a difference in religious belief, they'll put people out. They'll ostracize them. They don't want anything more to do with them. Won't even say hello to them when they're crossing each other in the street.
Or when they meet in the liquor store.
Personally, I don't drink, so I wouldn't know.
How do you like that, folks? The atheist is a teetotaler, and the preacher drinks.
The Methodist preacher, which I believe this was started by people who were teetotalers
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah. Methodists were teetotalers for a long time. In fact, clergy in the Methodist Church, up to as recently as I think the 1960s, had to take a vow of abstinence when it came to alcohol and tobacco.
We're making up for it now.
Yeah,
I've heard that too.
especially at annual conference.
Okay, kind of back to what I was asking.
Yeah.
Now that I don't have that awesome segue we had a moment ago.
Sorry.
That's all right. I was wondering if you might have any insight as to why there is this apparent instinct for people to ostracize people who have a difference in religious belief.
Yeah, I think honestly part of it stems from a theology of exclusion that has come by way of a very conservative interpretation of some specific scriptures that can be read to suggest that Christianity is a my way or the highway kind of religion. And that's certainly one way to read some of those texts. And when you combine that with some of the other New Testament writings and even some of the Old Testament writings about maintaining holiness and purity and that kind of thing within the community, part of that rejection stems from actually a very good desire, I think, to maintain a standard and a level of commitment to what you believe. That being said, I disagree with all of those interpretations. Another reason I think really what it comes down to is fear of the unknown. You know, we tend as human beings to fear what we don't understand. And the most common response that I get, especially from people who, like me, have spent all or most of their life in the church, is that they are completely oblivious to any other way of thinking. Or that a person of non-belief is not wholly defined by that non-belief. Right. That there are other elements of common ground, not necessarily even just as superficial as a shared love of video games, Magic the Gathering, and science fiction. But even deeper things like social justice and separation of church and state and and the intrinsic value of human life. All of these things, I think, are the fullness of encompassing. But in the church, in some churches, congregations, I should say, these are simplified and boiled down, like I said, to that litmus test. And when you fail the litmus test, then you can't be part of the conversation anymore. And so really I think it stems from a fear of, for lack of a better term, being polluted by this differing belief, that this will somehow separate you from your faith or belief, or that person's non-belief is going to catch.
Yeah, they see they see those different ideas as being a source of corruption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's beginning to change a lot. Honestly, where I see the greatest resistance to people of non-belief and in a number of other areas is among the generation just ahead of mine, my parents' generation, and really younger, because my mom's getting older now. Love you, Mom. She turns 60 this year, so I got to get my digs in.
Oh, you just outed her exact age.
I know. She's fine. She's wonderful. I love her to death. Hi, Mom. But the generation that is between 45 and 60 is where I actually find the most resistance to all manner of these different ideas in the church, generally. And that's been kind of surprising for me, because we usually hear that the older the generations go, the more conservative they get. But folks in that 65 and up generation, I find them to be some of the most open, affirming, welcoming, generous people, and even some people in my age group can be a little bit on the cut and dry. But really, like I said, I see the most resistance really in kind of that midlife range. And I don't know why, that's just my observation, is that kind of midlife range, something happens, and there seems to be some closure that happens for a while. I don't know what's going on.
I guess we'll find out in a decade or
I
so.
guess.
So there was one more specific question I wanted to ask. It's to do with the declining levels of religiosity in the United States, where as the communities of non-believers grow, consequently the community of believers is shrinking. Mm-hmm. And I don't say this as any kind of a judgment on the church or anything like that, but it's just a pattern that's emerged. And there are people within the religious community who want to get to the root of why this is happening. And I see a lot of articles written about why this is, and every now and then I feel compelled to respond to them at length. But among the people who are trying to do this research, there's very little outreach. And I think these are the people who probably have the most vested interest in speaking with non-believers, people who have left the church, and they're the least willing to do it. Do you have any idea why that's the case? Why there's this, on the one hand, thirst for knowledge about this reason, and at the same time, this huge hesitance to proactively get in touch with people who could provide them with that knowledge?
Well, I'll respond this way. Why do you think the church is declining? Part of it, I really do think, is because we already know the answer. We already know a lot of why people are leaving the church. And that if we were to actually ask the people who were leaving the church, they'd tell us what we already know, but what we don't want to hear, which is that we need to change. Not only as an institution, but also, I think, in the ways in which we both live out and share out what we believe, which is an essential part of our particular belief system, is that we are constantly sharing that with other people in a non-pressuring, loving, open way, not in a believe I'm gonna beat you over the head with the Bible kind of way. But honestly, I think part of it is fear that we may actually get confirmed what we already know. Again, that's just my speculation. I think another reason that I would speculate as to why is, frankly, because many of these people are the children of the people who are asking the questions, and they're not even able to have a conversation about these things in a way that is healthy and fruitful, where parents and children can actually talk about why they don't share their parents' beliefs.
Right.
And so I think there are some hurt feelings and some cross connections in just the ability for us to communicate faithfully with that group both because of who they are and because of, I think, some of our presuppositions about who they are. As an older millennial, and I don't identify as a millennial. I have none of the cultural markers of a millennial, but I do fit in the time.
You're in the age range.
Right. I feel like there are certain presuppositions about who millennials are and what they want, and especially as I interact with a number of other people my age, most of whom are clergy in the church, I have a very different perspective on where the millennial generation is in terms of their desire for church. And I think more than anything, what our generation of people has been hungering for is an authenticity that they did not find in their parents' church. And so now we are faced with the question, the parents now have to be faced with the reality of, okay, do we change? Do we listen? Or do we just keep doing things the way that we've always done them and hope that there'll be another cultural shift in time so that before we all die, people will come back to the church again? So those are just some of my speculations, I think, around why those people don't often get interviewed as part of those articles.
And I think everything else that I had conceived of was just asking for more and more speculation, so I think I'd rather open it to the floor.
Yeah, well, we've got about a half an hour left. So if you all have questions written down that you want to offer, we'll check. And if you guys want to take a few minutes to write down any questions, we can certainly do that, just to try and remove some.
I would like Michael's definition of a Christian, and I'd also like your definition of a Christian. When someone says those words, that word to you, what immediately comes to your mind?
You want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. Don't be influenced by my answer.
I'm influenced by many of your answers in regards to this topic.
Christian is such a loaded term. It's awful. Honestly, it really depends on who it is, how I respond to the question, how I respond to the label. Because for some people, when they say that they're a Christian, it's very clear to me that what they mean has nothing to do with the person of Jesus Christ. And the very definition of the word, this is just the definition of the word, is a Christian is a little Christ. That's put it together and that's what you got. So basically, what a Christian ought to be is someone who in their very lives mimics the life of the person Jesus Christ. And for too many people, that's not at all what seems to be the definition for them of what being a Christian means. Many have adopted the alternative, a Christ follower, to try and push off some of the negative baggage that comes from that. I've not really found anything that I like personally to replace it with. But for me, a Christian is basically someone who tries and fails to be Jesus in the world. Not exactly, not literally, but to live a life that comports with the life of Jesus Christ. That's my definition.
So, mine's very broad, but I would say a little more grounded.
This is what we came here to do. We didn't come here to get complimented or anything. There's no pressure here. Just let us know what you think.
Sure. Because Christianity is such a broad religion, it's very hard to pick a definition and then try to pigeonhole and identify people based on that label. So, you've got your really conservative Southern Baptists who believe the earth is 6,000 years old. You've got the more liberal Methodist church that's very accepting, more more grounded in reality, I suppose I would say. There's cultural Christians, who are people who don't necessarily have the religious belief anymore, but they still identify with the tradition and the history. And so because it's such a broad term, if someone identifies themselves to me as a Christian, they've told me nothing. I have to ask for more information to really get a sense of what that means to them. I basically don't have a definition of Christian. I really, like I said, I have to dig for more information if someone's going to use that label to identify themselves.
Honestly, that's the same way I feel about when someone identifies themselves to me as an atheist or a non-religious person.
Sure.
Effectively, you have told me one thing. You don't believe in a deity or deities. That tells me nothing about how you live your life, what you think is important. None of those kinds of commitments or anything like that. So I feel like, we're on the same page on that. Sure. We have a submission from the gallery. You may forego that question if you like.
So the question is, do I believe that I have a soul, and what happens to me after I die? And no, I happen to be an atheist who does not believe in these supernatural things such as souls. I view death as a cessation of consciousness. The comparison for children is made, it's like going to sleep. You just don't wake up. And that's very much how I view death. It's the end of conscious thought. So if there's any need for clarification, I'm happy to provide it. Yep.
So what you're saying is you're soulless worm food. Is that really what?
I don't care for that rhetoric.
I'm just kidding, of course.
Okay.
His body's right behind it.
So I just took one, so I'll let you start on that second.
Okay. So a question for me, is it productive for people of faith to be more involved in keeping our faith and our government separate? The simple answer for me to that question is yes, absolutely. In part because much of the label of Christian has become so culturally tied up that we actually lose our ability to be a faithful witness as a community of Christians when we let that be co-opted by the state. I think there's also a theological problem with that kind of background thinking, which it assumes that the way by which we are going to achieve our goals for the kingdom are going to come through an earthly kingdom, which Jesus pretty much explicitly and constantly said was not his kind of kingdom. So for us to then try and use an earthly kingdom to forward our goals, we are basically saying, we love you, Jesus, but we don't trust you. We're going to put our faith in this human system. And so that's why, in fact, when Mike has posted certain things about separation of church and state and some of the work he's been doing, mine is one of the first comments to be, absolutely.
It surprises me how fast he hits the like button on some of my posts.
There are a number of theologians, especially in the more modern era, who have wrestled with this question. I will turn you especially to a pacifist and Quaker by the name of John Howard Yoder, who wrote a short treatise called The Christian Witness to the State. And in it, basically, what he suggests is that while right now the way we work culturally in the United States is that to be a participant in government is actually living out our call to Christianity, and that not participating in the state is something we have to justify. He suggests quite the opposite, that anybody who wants to be actively participating in the actions of the state, even on the lowest level of government, actually needs to justify that to their church community, and not the other way around. That if you want to be a police officer and you're also a Christian, then you need to justify that with your faith, rather than being a Christian means that you should be a police officer or serve on the school board or be involved in government at all levels. So I encourage you to check him out. John Howard Yoder is his name, and the treatise is The Christian Witness for the State.
And so in a similar vein, I'm asked to explain more about freedom from religion. Is there room for people of faith? And I assume that's to mean in government. And I would say that yes, there is room for people of faith in government. There's rooms for all types of people in government. The trick is they need to be governing based on sound principles and evidence, rather than governing based exclusively on their religious belief. The phrase freedom from religion refers to a principle that's kind of implicit in freedom of religion. That is, people are free to practice their beliefs. But because of that, people who don't share those beliefs are free to not practice. So if there were if very conservative Baptists were elected to all sorts of positions in Congress and the presidency, and they started putting specific Baptist provisions into the law, then that would be unacceptable. That would be unacceptable to most of the people in this room because you're not specifically Baptists. That would be unacceptable to me because I'm in no way associated with that religion. I shouldn't be forced to practice it any more than you should be forced to practice it. So that's where that phrase freedom from religion comes from. It's that implicit statement from within freedom of religion.
We have a city councilman who is atheist, and when that came up in the original election, I said, gee, I think that's great. I said, the Christians haven't done a really good job so far. Why not? And that's pretty much what you've espoused here is, we Methodists, we say we have open minds, open hearts, open doors. That's sort of our motto. Open minds is a really tough one sometimes to get across. And I find that I would like to be at a gathering with you and have a long conversation. Because I would feel like I have more in common with you than lots of the
So-called Christians.
the Christians in our midst also. So it's great that you've done this, and I admire you for it.
Yeah. I appreciate you having me.
Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of Christians haven't learned from the past when Christianity was in control, back in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. There's perfect examples of why we shouldn't be like that.
Yeah, in fact, as a pastor in the United Methodist Church, I would like to apologize on behalf of Methodism for some of this syndrome, because we actually are to blame for a lot of it due to Methodism basically being the Christian mainstream denomination to be a member of if you were going to be a successful politician from the late 1800s all the way into the 1960s. We have in many ways as a denomination contributed to this idea that being a Christian and trying to forward a Christian agenda through government is the means by which God's kingdom is going to come about. And so on behalf of old Methodists, I apologize. This was especially true in the early 20th century. I think one of the numbers, if I remember correctly, in like the 1920s, some 80% of Congress were Methodists. And a majority of presidents from the early 1900s through the late 1940s were Methodists. And it's because that's what you were if you wanted to get anywhere in politics. So, Bob, yeah.
This is a little facetious, but playing on Steve.
It's all right, Mike and I are very facetious ourselves.
Playing on Steve Martin a little bit, does it bother you, Michael, that atheists don't have no hymns?
I'm not sure the camera picked that up, so I'm just going to repeat it. Bob's question was, Michael, does it bother you that atheists don't have no hymns?
You know, there's plenty of music that has nothing to do with religion. So
you feel well covered by
yes,
the...
yes.
Okay.
Power metal makes the drive over much easier.
Except for the hair in your face when you start.
Takes your attention off the
Yeah.
record too.
Todd, do you guys have a question there? I thought I saw you guys.
Now, these are non-judgmental, I promise. We just curious. We really are curious.
Okay. So the first question is, do I follow a philosophy or a moral code, and what is it? I loosely identify myself as a transhumanist. It shares a lot of the traits that I was talking about humanism earlier. There's also in it a sense that as technology improves, it can be integrated into human life to further improve the human condition.
So you're pro-Borg.
Something like that. And the second question is, what do I consider the Bible to be? Literature, moral tales, etc.
Fables?
It's something along that line. I want to choose my words carefully.
It wasn't a trick. You don't have to use them carefully.
Sure. The camera can be unforgiving. I view the Bible, the Bible is a collection of works. Some of these are historical documents, letters between people. Some of these are oral traditions that may have been exaggerated, turned into legend, and thereby passed down until eventually it got put into writing. So it really is a combination of different works that fall somewhere in that broad spectrum.
So here would be a follow-up question to that, and if this is rude or offensive in any way, I apologize, but do you find any value in those stories or that literature beyond simply them being old writings of an ancient people?
There is and there isn't, because there are certain teachings in there that, if read a certain way, carry value even through the current day. I think that when you hold the entirety of the Bible up as a holy book, it can lead you to holding all of the teachings up, whether they're outdated or not. And you can wind up holding on to some very outdated concepts that don't have a place in the modern world. So, is there value in it? In parts, certainly. In other parts, I think it can be counterproductive with the degree to which it's venerated.
Fair enough. I think there's too much Bible worship within the church.
Sure.
Anyway. So, there you go.
They weren't given pitchforks and torches before
No, they're in the closet around the corner.
So if I see people moving that way,
I told them to wait till 5 till, and then lock the doors, turn out the lights, let the lynching begin. So we've got just a few more minutes, and so I thought we would finish up with just a couple of kind of closing remarks, questions. And so this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. What is one of the most frustrating things for you about the conversation between religious people and non-religious people? And then second, what would be one or two things that you want people of faith to know about non-religious or non-believing people?
So the question about frustration, do you want one side or both sides?
Well, you can throw these questions back to me.
Okay.
So that was kind of the idea.
I mean, I don't just have problems with how religious people handle the dialogue.
Right.
I've also got problems with how some non-religious people handle the dialogue.
All right, well, you talk about how non-religious people handle the dialogue problematically, and I'll talk about my frustrations with how religious people handle the dialogue.
Because there are people within the non-religious community who see religion and non-religion as a dichotomy. There are rational, sound-minded atheists, and there are the Ken Hams of the world who believe it's 6,000 years old and they're not going to be convinced otherwise. And that's really toxic because that starts a trend on our side of the discussion of shutting out the religious community. And so then we wind up being just as guilty of not facilitating that relationship when we do have common goals to work towards. So we need to be aware that belief is a spectrum. Some people have beliefs that are closer to ours. Some people have beliefs that are further from ours. And we have to be willing to at least engage in conversation far enough to see where someone is on the spectrum before we dismiss them as being completely irrational. That's the big thing about the non-religious community, the way I see it. That's frustrating.
Yeah, my frustration with the way the religious community usually handles these actually goes back to something that we talked about a little bit already, and that's the ways in which religious people tend to label non-religious people as unredeemable, recalcitrant, and hostile, and then doing so in ways that basically demonstrate themselves to have certain unredeemable qualities, being recalcitrant in their own beliefs, and doing so in a hostile manner. Basically, in a single word, my problem with the way the religious community usually handles these conversations is the hypocrisy. That they in no way even remotely approximate the ways in which Jesus would approach someone in the same fashion. That there seems to be nothing about their behavior and action and words that in any way represents the person around whom our entire religion is based.
Sure.
And then also those Ken Ham people. So that for me is one of the most frustrating things for me is I don't think it's a problem that we have real disagreements. I don't even think it's a problem if we argue about them from time to time. I do think it's a problem when we start to dehumanize and other people simply because they don't share exactly our same beliefs or any belief.
With regards to the arguments, there's a time and a place for it. That's something that really both sides need to understand. Is yes, we can have our disagreements and we can air those disagreements, but we need to understand that not every single interaction has to be about this one difference. And that's a really frustrating thing because I was saying before we started that I've had some interactions with people where as soon as the word atheist comes up, it's the pop apologetics lines coming out, and it's just frustrating.
Sure.
You know, you said that there's a continuum.
Mhm.
I think there's more than one. I think that there's the open-minded, closed-minded
Sure.
on all the different religions and non-religions or philosophies. I find that there are some atheists that I get along way better than some at the other end of the Christian spectrum.
Absolutely.
I have friends that are Sikhs and friends that are Wiccan, you know, really nice people.
All right, so the last thing and what we'll wrap up and close with is what are one or two things that you would most want people of faith to know about, or I guess religious people to know about non-religious people?
There's good moral people out there who are in no way associated with religion. We're happy to interact with you to better the community and make life better for ourselves and for future generations. There are these common causes that we can work towards, and there's no reason that the religious divide has to be a divide. Certainly, again, there's the points of disagreement are worth disagreeing about and worth discussing, but when you do have one of those common goals come up, it's worth setting aside the difference and working towards those common ends.
Is that it?
I think that's the big one.
All right. For my side, and I'm not trying to take the last word, so if you have something else you want to say, please feel free. For me, one thing I really wish that more people more non-religious people knew about religious people is that there are plenty of us who are not Donald Trump, Creflo Dollar, Joel Osteen, pick your stereotype, that we also are multifaceted people that have genuine and deep passions and compassion for all people, and that we also have those common goals. I think we just sometimes come at them from different angles and for different reasons.
Sure.
But that would be the biggest thing that I would want non-religious people to know is that and just because I'm a pastor and I approach you and I ask you questions, that does not mean that I'm trying to convert you.
Right.
And that not all religious people are trying to get to know you simply out of a desire to convert you.
And that's another important reason why the first interaction can't be one of throwing out these apologetics arguments, because if that's what sets the tone, then the other party is going to assume that this is what the motivation is for interactions. So, even I've had to overcome this hurdle of assuming that not every conversation with a religious person is going to be about them trying to convert me. As I'm overcoming that hurdle, it can be very much helped by not starting with these apologetics arguments.
So if I'm hearing this right, you don't feel like you should be trying to convert him?
No. I don't feel like I should be trying to convert Mike. What I do feel like I should be doing is living my own faith with integrity, sharing that story with Mike at times that I feel are appropriate, and then letting, and this is, I'm trying to say this in a way, but
Sure, I know what you're getting at.
But basically, it's not my job to convert him. That's always been, as a Christian, that's always been the job of Jesus Christ via the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And that if God chooses to move that, that's great. But in the meantime, that's not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is that we are able to continue to be friends and share the things that we've shared for so long and continue to grow together in our relationship. And regardless of whether or not Mike someday comes to believe what I believe about this or not, we both are better for the sharing. And that's really where I am in that, and the rest really belongs to God.
Yeah.
Amen.
Well, I thought so. I just wanted to clarify in my mind.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that was
you both
helpful.
add to the tapestry of your lives. You embellish each other because you are different. You're not the same whatever, and by being those differences, you add to your quality of your lives.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I love you.